Hello everybody, I'm back with 3 more lost films from the 1920s. This series seems to be pretty popular, so I hope you enjoyed discovering this lost media together as much as I enjoy making these videos. So, without further ado, let's get into it. The first movie I want to talk about is mostly interesting because the lead actor was none other than Mr. Home Run, the Sultan of SWAT himself, Babe Ruth. That's right, the Babe appeared in a 1927 comedy drama called Babe Comes Home, about a baseball player named Babe Dugan. This was the same year Ruth famously broke the all-time single-season home run record and had a friendly home run competition with his teammate Lou Gehrig throughout the season. The same year the New York Yankees won 110 games, which is tied for 5th place in the all-time record list. And the same year the Yankees had its famous Murderers Row batting lineup that punished opposing pitchers. This was a year when Babe Ruth was in his prime. But this wasn't actually the first time Ruth had been in a movie. He appeared in an independent movie called Head and Home 7 years before. But that wasn't really a Hollywood movie, and it was released in 1920, when Ruth had certainly caught a lot of people's attention but hadn't yet achieved the godlike status that he would shortly thereafter. In Babe Comes Home, he starred with Anna Q. Nilsson as his leading lady, a pretty big name at the time despite being forgotten today. So, what was the movie actually about? The story was apparently not too complicated, though I couldn't find a very detailed summary of it. But here's a brief description I scrounged together, with some of my speculation thrown in. The main girl, played by Nilsson, works at a laundry in Los Angeles with 2 other characters, played by Louise Fazenda and Arthur Stone, who provide comic relief throughout the movie. At first, the girl is attracted to Babe because of his, quote, unromantic but effective dirty shirt of his baseball uniform, but then starts to get annoyed by having to wash it for him every week. Though she does get over this and they get married. They are a happy couple at first, and there are some scenes of them at an amusement park together. But they start going through a rough patch, one of the biggest, or perhaps the only reason, being Babe's chewing tobacco habit. They have a big row, where it appears from this still from the movie that Babe gets strangled at one point. The two separate, and Babe resumes his work as a professional baseball player. At the climax of the movie, Babe and his team, the Angels, are competing against another team in the final game, with the league pennant on the line. But there's one problem. Babe's lack of chewing tobacco negatively affects his game, and he can't hit as well as before. It gets to the 9th inning, and chances are running out. Babe will soon take his turn at the plate. His girl comes running from the bleachers to hand him a plug of chewing tobacco, which enables him to hit the winning home run. The end. As a little side note, I think it's interesting that the character Babe Dugan played for the Angels in Los Angeles, but the actual Los Angeles Angels wouldn't exist for another 30 years or so. I mean, it's not as coincidental as it sounds since Angels is in the name of Los Angeles, but I just thought I'd mention it. Ruth seemed surprisingly committed to the part. His schedule was tight, considering that he would have to start training soon for the next season across the country in New York, so filming time was pretty limited. And here's a little anecdote I found that, if true, gives a glimpse into the great Bambino's dedication into becoming a potential movie star. As an illustration of how serious Ruth took his job before the camera, director Ted Wilde told us about one of the days when he was rehearsing the Bambino for a thrilling hook slide to the home plate. Ruth on this occasion tried the hook 5 times, without meeting with this director's approbation. I said to him, Wilde quoted himself, "Try it just once more and we will shoot it." Ruth did, but this time went in on his left side. Asking him what the big idea was caused him to take me to his dressing room. There he showed me that a layer of skin had been rubbed off the right side by the rehearsals. To double down on the novelty of having Babe Ruth as a leading man, the film was released using a short-lived sound-on-film process called Vocafilm. Little information is known about this, but it is assumed that there was music and sound effects that played with the film. Babe Comes Home was released by First National Pictures, which was a pretty big movie studio at the time. They put a lot of effort into advertising the movie, imagining tie-ins targeting baseball fans, and expecting, at the very least, that the millions of baseball fans in the US would go see the movie. I mean, it featured Babe Ruth, The biggest name in baseball, maybe the biggest name in all sports. That was a pretty fair expectation from the studio, wouldn't you think? As surprising as it might sound, Babe Comes Home performed very poorly at the box office and was regarded as a flop. It seemed to be an advertiser's dream, but for some reason or another, it just didn't catch on. Maybe we'll get some kind of indication of why that was from some reviews from movie critics. I couldn't find a review that really panned the movie. Some reviewers were very enthusiastic, and some were more mixed. Take for example this excerpt talking about the kind of humor in the movie. Not so bad despite its tobacco-chewing fun by Babe, for those who like that kind of backyard comedy. But the picture will get hearty laughs from the character of picture audiences preferring westerns. So maybe the humor was a bit earthy, but there were plenty of people who would have enjoyed that kind of humor, as that last reviewer implied, so that probably wasn't the main reason for the movie's lack of success. So was it Babe Ruth's acting ability? I mean, he wasn't a professional, but had it been that bad? Quite a few publications actually praised Ruth's performance, though it's hard to tell if they're just complimenting him because they feel like they have to show him some respect. For example, here's one reviewer's praise of Babe Ruth's acting ability. His good-humored, never-quite-grown-up personality radiates out of Babe Comes Home. The lad is a screen bet, and no mistake, and he can act. Don't let anyone tell you different. Without effort, he is humorous and he is touching. Babe Comes Home isn't much of a comedy, and it is dreadfully padded, but Babe makes it a 6 best. Another reviewer who had attended the preview of the movie before its official public premiere also had some pretty nice things to say, though not exactly raving. A satisfied audience wended its way from the Westlake Theater following the preview of Babe Comes Home, starring Babe Ruth. The Babe proved a pleasant surprise as an actor, and the picture is far above the usual hokum featuring stars of the sporting world, whose only qualification for a screen role is the position they maintain in the said world. Ruth does not try to act accordingly to the dictates of our best dramatic schools, which is probably the one reason why the picture provides pleasant entertainment. He depends upon a naturalness for which he is typical in private life, and made no attempt to show up John Barrymore, Jack Gilbert, or other of our well-known thespians of the screen. So it seems we'll have to look elsewhere for a reason why the movie bombed. In one apt article from Photoplay magazine, sprinter Charlie Paddock wrote about why athletes fail in the movies. His conclusion can be summed up with one comment he made about Gertrude Ederle, the first woman to swim across the English Channel. The public was interested in Gertrude Ederle the swimmer, and not in Gertrude Ederle the actress. But really, we can replace the name Gertrude Ederle with any other athlete's name. And this is probably the simplest explanation of all. In that same article, Paddock mentions a plethora of athletes who gave movies a try in the 1920s. Jack Dempsey, Gene Tunney, Red Grange, Gertrude Ederle, Duke Kahanamoku, Bill Tidden, Johnny Weissmuller, Benny Leonard, and, of course, Babe Ruth. All had tried, but all had failed. There were also celebrities from outside of movies that tried as well, like opera stars and singers. But because we're still talking about the silent era, their talent could not translate over. It's the same reason why no one wanted to watch, say, Clara Bow pursue pro tennis, or Richard Dix pitch in a baseball game, at least after the novelty of it went away. They weren't athletes, they were actors, just like how the athletes weren't actors. So even if Babe Ruth had been a decent actor, audiences had seen so many athletes before him fail to make a good impression on the screen, so why would they have any reason to think that he would have done any differently? When Space Jam was released, did anyone expect Michael Jordan to be the next Orson Welles? I don't think so. So that's the story of Babe Comes Home. It's disappointing that we probably will never get to see for ourselves Babe Ruth acting in a real Hollywood movie, especially when it was the same year that he broke that home run record and became the biggest pop culture icon aside from Charles Lindbergh. But there's always a chance. The main reason I included Fox Movietone Follies of 1929 is because it's one of the handful of big-budget review-type movies from the short musical craze of 1929. Other similar movies like Broadway Melodies and Hollywood Review of 1929 have survived, so it's a shame that no part of Movietone Follies is extant. With that said, it's very unlikely that it was anything truly amazing. With cameras still being rather immobile at the time due to the new process of making talkies, you almost definitely wouldn't have seen any of the interesting cinematography that many later lavish musicals had. But it still would have been lavish to some degree. There would have been many interesting costumes, beautiful women, and songs with choreography. Although it was primarily a musical review, there was a story, as almost all of these older musicals felt obligated to include for some reason. It tells the story of a man from Virginia named George Shelby, who sells his plantation for $50,000 and goes to the city to dissuade his sweetheart, Lila Beaumont, from continuing her career on the stage. But she refuses, and they have a row. A bit later, George overhears the owner of the show complaining about finances, so George offers to buy into the show for $50,000, the money he got from selling his property. The show's owner, thinking that the show would be a flop, gladly accepted, though didn't tell George about how bad it was. George, now the showrunner, tries to fire Lila so that she will marry him and they can settle down in Virginia, but Lila refuses to be fired and goes on with the show. George then turns the show around and makes a big profit. He then pays back the money to the shocked owner of the show. Lila, satisfied that the show was a success, finally agrees to marry George. But no one, and I mean no one, went to this movie or any of the other talkie reviews for the story. They came for the music, the entertainment, and the pageantry. So what was that aspect of the movie like? That's the trickiest part, since it's difficult to write about those kind of things in detail. Usually, reviewers just left vague comments like when this one wrote, "It goes without saying, of course, that the picture is excellent, splendid, wonderful, and any reasonable interpretation of that overworked adjective." Another reviewer wrote, "The necessary ingredients run something like this: catchy music, plenty of pretty girls and keen limbs, snappy tempo, attractive sets, a dash of comedy. Fox Movietone Follies has 'em, and that's exactly what makes the picture what it is." A third reviewer simply exclaimed, "Glorified gals, legs, abbreviated costumes, everything." Instead, we have to settle for little snapshots those reviewers provided, usually highlighting a single memorable part. For example, almost every review I read mentioned that Stepin Fetchit, a black dancer and performer, was one of the best parts of the movie. This is what one person had to say about him. "At one time, he is called upon to do a dancing number, filling the place of the regular dancer who had not appeared at the theater on time. His feet move like lightning. The singing is excellent." Another mentioned that his sleepy characterization earned many laughs. This sleepy characterization probably referred to Fetchit's specialty of playing characters that were lazy and not too bright on the surface. It's a kind of comedy that many today would probably find offensive, but it was what it was. Another reviewer briefly mentioned something about a segment involving Daniel Boone and a shotgun marriage, but I don't know much more than that. Then, of course, there were the songs, which were probably the most memorable things from the movie. And this was one thing that surprised me. There were two songs I already knew and enjoyed that came from this movie. These were "That's You, Baby" and "Big City Blues," and these were songs I discovered through Annette Hanshaw's recordings of them. Another song called "Walking with Susie" was singled out by most as one of the best songs featured, though I had not been familiar with it previously myself. The structure of the movie alternated between segments of the review itself, with the singing and dancing, and the week's story, though these segments went all the way through without interrupting each other. Here's a description from a person who actually saw the movie. "My memory for these things isn't so good, but I should say there were 7 or 8 chunks of straight folly stuff, separated by an equal number of story chunks. The folly sequences are linked only by the appearance of players in one and the other, which is quite link enough for anyone. While the movie was all in black and white, there was one little extra novelty, one Technicolor sequence. However, all agreed that it served little purpose, and one reviewer described it as very beautiful but hardly appealing to the masses. Overall, the reviews were a bit mixed, or maybe lukewarm is a better word. Here is a sample of one person's general thoughts. Of course, there are other songs with a great deal of dialogue, with movement, a sequence in color, and all the ingredients found in this sort of entertainment on the stage. All but cleverness, inspiration, professional ease, call it what you will. The success of a big review depends not only on spectacular beauty, but expert dancing and singing, little of which is found in this screen replica. All the music, bustle, and movement fail to conceal the dearth of talent, nor does it drown the thin, screeching, untrained voices. The reason why there wasn't expert dancing and singing was because Fox used people from its own stock company, people who were mostly not professional dancers or singers. But no one really said that this, in itself, was fatal. I think putting the Fox Movietone Follies in the right context will help you understand why you might have found it exciting at the time. Put yourself in the shoes of an average outside-of-the-city movie watcher in 1929. Maybe you've already seen a talkie or two, but have never seen a live stage show like the Ziegfeld Follies. Watching this movie or any of the similar musical review films would have been a bit of a revelation for you. Movies like those relied heavily on a good first impression, which is partly why the movie studios went all in on them. The format of musical review films was nothing special, and that trend died very quickly once people realized that they were all basically the same. But the first time you watched something like this, it would have been really special, and that's what I imagine when I think about the Fox Movietone Follies of 1929. Compared with other big studio musicals of 1929, Fox Movietone Follies wasn't the best. Nearly all evidence points in that direction, and it was beaten out at the box office by quite a few other review-style movies that used the same formula, but were either better made or upped the ante with a larger-scale production that quickly overshadowed Movietone Follies. The best examples of these are MGM's two movies, The Broadway Melody and The Hollywood Review of 1929, and Warner Brothers' two movies, On with the Show and Gold Diggers of Broadway. But none of these other films are lost now, leaving Fox Movietone Follies as a sort of missing puzzle piece among big studio review movies. At the very specific time that Movietone Follies was released, there had not yet been an all-color musical. I say very specific because the first all-talking and all-color feature film, On with the Show, premiered only 2 days after Movietone Follies premiered. From then on out, all-talking, all-color musicals became the thing to make, and since Movietone Follies had only contained one color sequence, it would have been very quickly forgotten, even as a novelty. Many reviewers thought that Movietone Follies would perform far better outside of New York because it was not quite as good as Broadway shows, and thus would be better suited for audiences who had never seen a Broadway show or a Ziegfeld Follies show. But I can't help but think that once the better all-color musicals made the rounds outside of New York, it still wouldn't have stood a chance, but that's just a hunch. The last film I'm going to talk about is Penrod. This movie was based off an earlier novel by Booth Tarkington, one of the most popular American authors of his day. The reason why I chose to include this movie is because it featured quite a few big-name child actors, including Peggy Cartwright, Jackie Condon, and Ernie Morrison, all of later Our Gang fame, Baby Peggy, Noah Beery Jr., son of actor Noah Beery Sr. and nephew of actor Wallace Beery, and Wesley Freckles Berry, who played the title character Penrod. Because this movie was based off of a book, we can more or less understand what the story is about, even though it didn't stick to the original exactly. So I'll go through a brief summary of it, which was taken largely from the exhibitor's trade review. Penrod, only son of Mr. and Mrs. Schofield, has the reputation of being the orphalest boy in town. With the help of his lieutenant, Sam Williams, Penrod has organized the American Boys Protective Association to protect the independence of boyhood, repeal the curfew laws, and insist upon equality of ages. Penrod breaks up an amateur show staged by socially prominent Mrs. Laura Rubush. Penrod's costume consists of part of his father's cast of red flannels. To hide these, the youngster steals some garments from the janitor, and when these commence to unravel, the stage director hurriedly calls "Curtain!" and rushes behind the stage to stop the fight that has started. Penrod is always getting into trouble. His imagination, after seeing a play that exposes the evils of drink, leads him to start a rumor about a worthy husband that horrifies the town. He scandalizes the dancing class by his antics during a cotillion and a bad case of hives. He falls off a roof to escape going to a dance where his suit with Pretty Marjorie is eclipsed by Maurice Levy, who is a model of propriety. Penrod makes himself so obnoxious around his sister and her suitor that the latter gives the boy $2 to clear out. A trip to the circus follows, and the visiting physician that evening prescribes castor oil. Roop Collins, tough boy of town, visits the ABPA and bullies the whole gang until he runs afoul of Herman and Vermin, the two colored boys. The two boys get rid of him with the use of scythes and lawnmowers in hair-raising manner. The existence of the ABPA is jeopardized. The irrepressible cutting up of its members has aroused the ire of all the leading citizens, but the boys effect the capture of two notorious bandits who have been terrorizing the neighborhood, and the threats of excoriation are turned into paeans of praise. So many times when I come to this part of each segment talking about reviews of the film, I often say that it was panned or had lukewarm reviews. But in the case of Penrod, most people wrote rave reviews, and it's not too hard to imagine why. In the early 1920s, Hollywood really figured out how profitable child stars could be. At that time, we can see the rise of child stars like Jackie Coogan and Baby Peggy, as well as the entire cast of Our Gang. And if you've ever seen any films with those child stars in them, you'll know that they're usually very good. Many of these kids were fine actors, or at least had enough spunk to win audiences over. And remember that cast of kids I said earlier? Peggy Cartwright, Ernie Morrison, Jackie Condon, Baby Peggy, and Wesley Berry, instantly recognizable by his famous freckles. All of these kids were talented and delightful on screen, as evidenced by their other performances. Berry especially was a very popular child actor in 1922, though has sadly been forgotten over the years, probably partly due to many of his films being lost. The original Penrod stories by Booth Tarkington were episodic, so there wasn't one continuing storyline, and the movie followed a similar format, though it was updated to fit the new decade. One example of these modernizations could have been seen when a jazz band was introduced, and Penrod requests Paul Whiteman's latest and shows off his modern dance moves. Because of the format of the film, not every review mentions the same parts, so I'll stitch in some other descriptions of scenes from the movie so you can get a better picture of what it was like. For example, Penrod and his friends have a cave that's a sort of headquarters of their so-called American Boys Protective Association, complete with lodge rooms that can hold all of the 30 members. Here, they have initiations and secret meetings. Penrod also has a dog who is his main companion. Penrod, trying to read an unnamed forbidden book in secret, hides behind a Victrola, but the dog gives away his hiding place. And in one of Baby Peggy's scenes, Penrod is forced to dance with Peggy instead of the older girl he actually wants to dance with. The episodic nature of the movie was one of the only complaints that many people had, though it did not ruin the picture, as this one reviewer explains. Were it not for its length, 8 reels, Penrod would be one of the cleanest, healthiest, and most wholesome feature pictures ever turned out. Amusing to the highest degree, it somehow becomes tiresome through its over-footage, and one cannot help thinking how preferable if some of the simple incidents had been omitted. None of the scenes is prolonged, but there are so many. It is like calling on friends and having the child of the house perform his little stunts. You are entertained for a time, but after a while, you long for the time to put the youngster to bed. Another person said a very similar comment as well. The movie consisted of about 8,000 feet of film, which roughly calculates to a little bit under an hour and a half. So perhaps shortening it a little bit might have helped it not feel like it was dragging on for too long. It was very common to have feature films that were only about 70 minutes or so it wouldn't have been out of place. But in general, reviews of Penrod often read like this: "Reels and reels of pure joy. You'll sit spellbound unless you are so old and sour that you've forgotten the days when you were Penrod's age." A regular review of this is impossible. A picture you can sit through again and again and laugh more heartily every time. Chuckles and guffaws and shrieks according to the scenes presented. Yes, it's all in the film. The pageant, perhaps the funniest thing on celluloid. Penrod's party and the new Wiggly dances, all performed for your benefit. Almost every scene is charming or funny. So it's clear that Penrod was a great movie for parents to take their children to, because kids as well as adults could enjoy the humor. It seems to me that, like other popular movies with child stars in the early 1920s, Penrod had a great team behind it to make clever gags, and really take advantage of the funny way kids often behave. The director, Marshall Nealon, had quite a bit of experience in these kid pictures. And specifically, he had worked with Wesley Berry in a few features before making Penrod, so they both would have understood the formula by that point. Really, if you've ever watched a Baby Peggy short, the witty gags, jokes, and spoofs are reminiscent of something out of a Harold Lloyd movie, and for that reason, I would love to watch this movie someday. So, which of these 3 movies would you like to see the most? Let me know in the comments. Also, let me know if you have any suggestions for 1920s lost films that I should cover in a future video. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.